creativity and our efforts in creativity and our joy in creativity translates into critical thinking in a way that people don't talk about enough. Because the more you use your imagination and have confidence in your imagination, the more you can have confidence in your critical thinking and pay attention to what's going on in the world.
Hello, and welcome to the Your Creative Mind podcast. I am so glad you're here and listening. I want to talk to you about today's guest, Rosanne Limoncelli. Today's guest brings a precision of historical research, the imagination of a novelist, and the insight of a longtime educator shaping storytellers at NYU, New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Rosanne is a writer, a filmmaker, and a teacher whose work moves between sort of World War II historical mysteries and 1970s New York thrillers, and it's grounded in emotional truth and empathy. And I have to say it, women play a central role in all of her books. In this conversation, you're going to hear how stories become a practice of learning from everything, how creativity strengthens consistency, and how writing can deepen your understanding of people and the world around you. If you're looking to strengthen your own creative voice, build a sustainable writing practice, and think more clearly through story, I think this episode's going to offer you some really great insights and some practical inspiration from someone who's guided writers for decades. Rosanne, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Isolde. I'm so happy to be here. This is going to be a fun day.
I hope so. So let's just jump on in. I wanna start with sort of that spark, that pivotal moment that went from teaching to writing historical mysteries, to filmmaking. How did that moment shape your creative path that led you to writing novels like The Four Queens of Crime and Death at King's Cross?
Well, it's, definitely the creative spark started way before teaching. And I was thinking a lot about this because I hear a lot of writers say, oh, I was writing little stories when I was a little kid and, I was a big reader. And my journey is a little bit different because I was definitely a big reader. I was, from a very young, I read very young. All I wanted to do was read. My parents were like, go sit outside at least and, just go play outside. But I would just take my book outside. And I was just totally immersed in the world of other people's imaginations. So I didn't think of myself as a writer. I didn't think, oh, I could be a writer when I was young. But what I did do, and I remember this very specifically, we did a lot of, I have brothers and sisters, we did a lot of, make-believe play. We would, and some of those were based on stories I read. I remember, when I was very young, we lived in Middletown, Connecticut, and there was this big sort of farmland behind our house. And there was a little pond with three pine trees. And I remember we used to call it Sherwood Forest, and we would play Robin Hood. And this is like 3 years old. I don't even remember how I knew about Robin Hood at 3 years old. But that was, one of our favorite games. And we would just, run around in nature and pretend to be Robin Hood and his merry men. And I remember a lot of make-believe games like that. And so, for me, my writing started in my imagination. It didn't get on paper for many years. And, for years, again, big reader, kept reading, but I kept doing all kinds of imaginative play. And then that led me to theater. And my parents did bring us to a lot of theater, a lot of children's theater. And we started doing shows in our backyard. We would put on little shows for the neighborhood. And, I guess, I don't think we ever wrote anything down. And so I never thought of it as writing. And in school, for some reason, we didn't do any creative writing. I don't remember doing creative writing in elementary school or even in like middle school for some reason. But then when I got to high school, and by then we had moved to New Jersey, there was a lot more theater. I got involved in that, and there was a little bit of writing, but I hate to say the teachers were not very encouraging, and they were kind of more like, well, you're not a good writer, or,
Yikes.
Yeah, so I didn't think of myself as a writer through high school. I kept doing more theater. I started a little theater company when I was 18. We did mime, and we did all kinds of sort of experimental things that had a lot of movement and very few words. So I think I was maybe intimidated by writing down words from not having a practice of it, not being encouraged to do it, and then being discouraged to write things down, unfortunately. But then eventually I did start trying to write And I did some because I got into filmmaking. So the theater kind of led, and I did a lot of did some photography. And when I kind of found filmmaking, and granted, this was a long time ago. This was in the '70s, so we didn't have iPhones or video cameras. We had film, is all we had, and that was a lot harder and a lot more expensive. But I was lucky that my uncle had a 60 millimeter camera that he gave to me, and I did a little bit of filmmaking. And so the idea of visual storytelling without words was really something that started me on my journey. And then I went to film school. I was doing a lot of theater, and I didn't go to college right away after high school, but eventually I went to film school at NYU. And that's when I, of course, had to do more writing for school. And I had some teachers who were encouraging, some who were also discouraging. But by this time, I was a little bit older, and I had a little more confidence in my storytelling, in my visual storytelling. So, of course, what I know now is writing takes practice. Writing is a practice. And if you're brand new at it, just like playing a guitar or playing the piano, the first time you sit down to do it, of course, you're not very good because it's something that takes practice. So, I think my years of reading was part of that practice, learning about story, understanding story, you know, filmmaking, watching films and TV, reading books. And then when I started to practice, I had a little bit of a leg up because I had experienced so much story, like most of us. And, that's what I tell my students: you are a storyteller. You may not have enough practice in a certain aspect that maybe you want to do, but you are a storyteller because we grow up with stories around us just 24/7, especially now. So, I eventually started writing, and then I got really into it, all kinds of writing, and a lot more filmmaking. And, as an educator, I had been teaching theater and teaching young folks since high school. And I always felt, because I didn't always have a positive teacher student experience, unfortunately, that I wanted to teach because I wanted to give other students a positive experience. I never wanted to say, you're bad at what you do, or, yell at them for not doing something right, which was unfortunately a lot of my experience. So I loved being able to teach, so that I could say, you're doing great, keep going, keep practicing. I love this part of what you're doing, try harder here. And so, teaching filmmaking, I taught technical, camera, and then I started teaching filmmaking and story writing. And while I was working, and I started working at NYU in the technical academic area, and then I got a master's and PhD in teaching, reading, writing, and media. And that was amazing. Talk about encouraging teachers. They were the ones who really said, you are a writer, you could do this, you could, I just went in to get a master's after I finished my undergraduate, just because I thought, oh, I'll keep taking some classes, I get a discount because I work at NYU. And those teachers were so encouraging. They said, keep going, go for the PhD, which I never had considered in my entire life. I never thought of myself as, honestly, I never thought of myself as a smart person, because that was another thing some educators did to me. But I wanted to turn it around. So I kept going with these teachers who were so amazing. I got my PhD, which, my focus was on actually, empowering students through filmmaking and giving them the confidence to be storytellers and to just to be people. Because I think, one connection I think a lot of people don't make: creativity, and our efforts in creativity and our joy in creativity translates into critical thinking in a way that people don't talk about enough. Because the more you use your imagination and have confidence in your imagination, the more you can have confidence in your critical thinking, and pay attention to what's going on in the world and be a better participant to the world. Anyway, this is going on a long tangent, but I think that my creativity really started with imaginative play, and it took many, many years for me to get into writing, because of the lack of encouragement. But once I did, I had a lot of practice to do. And I, wrote for many, many years before I started writing, what I would consider publishable novels. But that was the fun, right? I mean, I love writing. I love having fun writing. And, getting published was like, icing on the cake. Putting together things that other people wanted to read while I still had the joy of making them myself. For me, that's just like the perfect life.
Alrighty. There's so much there. Yeah, and it's fascinating to me what you said earlier about everybody's a storyteller. I say that to every student I've ever taught writing, and that is if you ever made up an excuse for why you were late coming home, you're a storyteller. You've been telling stories since you were knee high to a grasshopper. And that's so true. And I do want to say how sorry I am on behalf of all the people who love your writing and people who haven't discovered it, that you had people who didn't encourage you and in fact discouraged you from being the storyteller that you are. I guess the thing that I want to know, and this is a bit more of an internal psychological question, because and I'll get to Charles Lim in a second, but what were you able to do to persevere past the people who were the naysayers? What did you do? Or how did you think? What did you change?
Well, first of all, I think that, of course, no one ever could say I was a bad reader, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I also loved movies. So I think I, maybe a little too much, immersed myself in books and movies because I escaped in them. And maybe in some ways that was too much of an escape as far as, progressing in some, I don't know, creative way for being a writer. But it was actually excellent training for later, to feed into my practice of writing, because I had so many great writers in my head and so much of that experience. So how did I make the switch? I think of this is a crazy story, but I remember being in like fourth grade, and just because being such a big reader, I loved words and I loved, the idea of writing, even if I didn't think of myself as a writer. And I remember the teacher said something, and they said a word that I didn't know. So I raised my hand and I asked, "How do you spell that word?" And she looked at me, she goes, "What are you doing, writing a book?" And it was a it was a diss, right? It was like, why are you asking that weird question in my class? And because we weren't talking about, it was like a science class or something, right? We weren't talking about writing, but the word, I think that I see words in my head
Mm-hmm.
all the time. I think that as I narrate my life in my head, or as I, go around my world, I think I'm seeing words. And even I was thinking about this. I do a lot of audiobooks when I'm not able to like sit down and read. I
Mm-hmm.
do both, paper books and audiobooks. And I think when I'm listening to audiobooks, part of my brain is seeing the words as the person is saying them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that because of so much reading, I think that the idea of writing words was always in my brain trying to come out. And when I, did some theater, and then I remember I used to, write out the words of the dialogue I was doing. It's like my brain was trying to make me a writer. It just was using everyone else's words at first.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in film school, we had to write our own scripts. And I had already tried, I think I said, doing some adaptations. Like I would take a Dashiell Hammett book and try and turn it into a screenplay just on my own, just because of like, oh, that would make a great movie. No one's made a movie on that. And I would try and sort of do that on my own. So, finding the confidence to make my own, to believe in my writing, started with filmmaking, because I had to write out my scripts. But I think it really didn't. I think it took years, Isolde. Honestly, it took years. I took a lot of different classes on writing and short story writing, and I, watched every kind of, you know, TED Talk and podcast, and everything about story. And I helped my students write. And I was doing writing during that time, but I think I didn't really have the confidence in it until probably working with other people in writing groups. And I always tell my students this: start a writing group. Start a writing group of encouraging people, of people that you want to help and people that want to help you. Listen, share your writing, give each other encouraging and critical, comments, and keep doing that as a practice. And I think you build it. It's like a muscle. You slowly build up the confidence to believe in your own writing, but also to understand that it is a practice, and everything can be everything can be improved, everything can be polished. And when you write a piece and you go over it and over it and over it to keep polishing it and keep making it better, um, I think it does make you feel like, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's better. And there's down days, right? Where you think like, "Ugh, I don't like this. Right? What am I doing? I don't even like this." And then 3 days later, like, wait, this is brilliant. So, it's a process. And I think it's allowing yourself to enjoy it is something that really helps the confidence, and to understand that it's a practice and you're always getting better. It doesn't matter how old you are, you're always getting better. I think if you talk to any writer, and I tell my students this, every book you read is 100 drafts. It's not just 3 drafts, it's 100 drafts. And you have to understand that writing is a lot of work. And if you like the work, great, then jump in. If after 3 or 4 drafts you're like, oh, I'm so done with this, well, then maybe, it's just for fun. But I think to get something published, you have to be aware of how much work there is involved. And in order to get that work done, you have to have some enjoyment in it, right? So I think the enjoyment part is maybe in some ways more important than the confidence, or just as important as confidence. If you like what you're doing and you're having fun with it because you like words or you like story, you're like, oh, especially with mysteries for me, because it's like, oh, I thought of this great clue that'll be fun to put in there. So, when you're having fun with it, you want to keep doing it. And I guess that's a kind of confidence, right?
Sure, sure. And it's interesting. As I'm listening to you, I'm going, yes, 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 absolutely. Except for the teacher who told you, what are you writing a book? Because immediately, would you like to know what I thought? I immediately went to, oh, your teacher didn't know how to spell the word.
Maybe.
I'm serious. Like that. Think about it. When you and I were kids and we were students, teachers were meant to be. Nowadays, it's a lot more free. Teachers don't always have to know every answer. There's a more of a sort of environment or atmosphere of exploration. Whereas back then, teachers were the ultimate authority. And if they didn't know something, that was really bad. And I can totally see that teacher just not knowing how to spell it. And instead of going, wait, you know what? I have to look that up. I'm not sure how to spell it. The teacher went, what are you writing a book? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
they had a knee-jerk reaction to
Yeah.
something that probably happened to them as students. And that's one thing we talked a lot about when I was getting my graduate degree, is that, teachers can only teach from their own model.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've only had bad teachers, it's difficult to be a good teacher. And I see that, and I see that in the creative arts, that a lot of, I think a lot of my teachers that didn't like my work were frustrated filmmakers and writers that never, made it as big as they had hoped they would. So they were, stuck teaching, and, they didn't like it very much. And so they kind of took it out on their students.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in all across academia, whether it's, middle school, high school, or university. So I have a lot of empathy for those teachers. I really do. And especially now, I can look back and have empathy for what they were going through. Not that, and you're right, it is different today. We can say, hey, let's look that up. Not every teacher does that even still now. They can be very defensive about it. But certainly another thing, I think, besides the defensiveness of teachers who, aren't in a place where they want to be, I think also, certainly in college, a lot of my stories were for women, honestly. I was writing from it, not that they were necessarily only for women, but I was writing from a woman's perspective because
Sure.
I was a woman, and that's where, that's where I was coming from. And a lot of my teachers were men. So, they didn't really like the topics of my scripts and stories because they couldn't relate to them. And that's, another reason why it's so important to have, a diversity of teachers, and to
Mm-hmm.
find a teacher that really understands you and understands your point of view. Look at how many books have been, turned down 50, 100 times before they became giant bestsellers.
Sure.
It's a matter of finding your audience, and that includes your teacher. If your teacher doesn't like your story, then they're not going to be able to be encouraging necessarily. And I take that very seriously as a teacher. I'm above 60, and I have all, my students are in their 20s, most of them. I don't get a lot of the stuff they're trying to say. I try. I have a son in his 20s, so I try and keep up with what is going on in the world. But, one thing I do is I have the students do a lot of peer review with each other to discuss their stories with each other because they understand each other better. I try and learn from their stories to understand where they're coming from, and help them with the structure of the story and how they tell the story to make it better, to help them practice and make it better. But I never tell anyone this story isn't a good one to tell, or you know don't tell that story. No one will want to read it. I tell them, you will find your audience, even if it's 3 people. You will find an audience for this story. You will find there is an audience for every single story. Maybe if it's Star Wars, it's 1 billion people. But if it's something else, maybe it's only a dozen. Maybe it's just your friends. Maybe it's fan fiction online. Maybe it's a short story in a zine. But you will find an audience. Every story finds their audience, and that's different than, hey, that's different than the publishing world, right? Which says, okay, is this marketable? Is this going to sell enough for it to be worth it for me to publish it? And I think that's the hard part about publishing, is saying, you know, I don't say write to an audience, write what you want to write, but publishing is a business, and they have to, find things that have enough of an audience to pay for the money they've put into it. That's just a reality.
Sure. And the thing is that sometimes you're ahead of your time and you write something that no one wants right now, but wow, will they want it 6 years from now, 7 years from now? That's happened to me,
Mm-hmm.
where my protagonist, for example, in my tarot reader mysteries, people are now really discovering tarot. It's becoming a lot more mainstream. Netflix is using it in the marketing campaign, tarot cards. And all of a sudden people are going, ooh, you have a protagonist who's a tarot reader, tell me more. Whereas before it was, oh, it's of the devil. So things
Right.
shift, they change. And it's really interesting to me because as I'm listening to you talk about this, the things that keep coming in my mind are feedback. And what, to me, I always try to do something along the lines of what you do when I'm giving feedback, and that is what works for me and what doesn't work for me. It's not good or bad. It's whether or not it's working or whether or not it's confusing
Exactly.
to me. And so there's something to that, I think, as we creatives explore our inner landscape and try to put it out into the outer landscape, whether it's writing or filmmaking or music or anything else. Some of it is you have to have a thick enough skin, I think, to show your work. But also you have to, as you put it, show your work to the right people and then practice, practice, practice. And here's the
Right.
thing that I wanted to say about this and then ask you about it. Uh, I his episode hasn't aired yet because I'm doing things a little out of order, but I just recently had a neuroscientist who specializes in music, as far as how our brains filter music, how our brains, what our brains look like when we're making music, et cetera, et cetera. And I
Mm.
asked him, I said, neuroscientifically, neurologically, tell me what is the best way to improve on a musical instrument, let's say. And he just went, yeah, practice. He said, talent gets you only so far, and not that far, actually. He said the big thing that's going to move the needle is practice. So I would love to just sort of, before we move on to the rest of the many questions I have for you, can you tell me what your writing practice is?
Yes, and I have a extra comment about that too, since you brought that up. So I'm at a point in my life where, and we talked about this before, I love writing, and I just love being able to have the time to write because, as a grown up, there's a lot of things to do. You have to work, you have to make a
Mm.
living, you have to take care of other people, and, do lots of things. So, in order to have time to write is a joy and a luxury. So I make time to write, and I put it on my calendar. I say, okay, every morning I'm going to write for an hour. And some people, I tell my students, an hour is like amazing. If you have children, you never have time to write. So I would write 20 minutes on my subway ride into work. That was the only time I had to write. And back then, it was. I used to write in my Palm Pilot, which was like a
Mm,
BlackBerry, like a little, the before iPhones, and on the
hmm.
tiny keyboard. So, I would find the time to write. And people say, "Oh, I don't have time to write," and I always say, "Well, actually, you do, because do you have 20 minutes? Because 20 minutes a day is a lot more than you think." People think, "Oh, I need a whole day, or I need a 4 hour block, I need a big thing." Well, that's great if you can find that, but if you don't have that, if you write 20 minutes a day, that's 1 page a day. In a year, you'll have a novel. And if you didn't write 20 minutes a day, in a year, you won't have a novel.
Right.
So I'm a really big believer in writing every single day, even if it's, and now, but let me redefine writing. So everyone's different. Some people write about one thing at a time and they just have one story they're working on and then they move on to the next story. I have too many ideas. I have
Right.
a whole list of stories that I'm always working on. And so I have to like make myself work on one at a time. But when I choose that story that I'm working on, um, I, I make that my priority. So when I wake up in the morning, if I don't write right away, I at least think about that story. Okay, what's that story about? What's the character? So maybe I'm doing a free write from that character's point of view, like their diary, or maybe I'm reading a book that is research or the same kind of mood or genre to the book I'm writing, so that it helps me get into the mood to write. And so then if I do that first thing in the morning, then all day long, no matter what I'm doing, I'm at my job, I'm teaching, I'm an administrator at NYU, I'm doing technical research, in between my other thoughts, I'm still thinking about that character in that story. So I consider the whole day part of my writing. Anytime I have a moment to think, I'm like, well, what's the next scene that they do? Okay, this scene. And then I do kind of I do a lot of charts and graphs and lists. So I'm, writing down all the different scenes that could possibly happen. So this is at the beginning of a book, right? All the different scenes that could possibly happen in this story, and all the different characters. I make lists of the characters and little bits of information about them. Oh, maybe I need a neighbor that's kind of like this, or I need a housekeeper that does this. So my practice, while it might not be writing 10 pages a day, it is working on the story every day. And then I make commitments to myself. I say, okay, at least 4 nights a week, you're going to go home, you're going to make dinner, you're going to hang out with your family for a little bit, and then you're going to write for 2 hours. You're not going to watch TV. You're not going to, clean out your closet. You're not going to do laundry. You're going to write for 2 hours. So I look at my calendar, my actual calendar on my computer, and I put on my calendar, write for 2 hours, write for 2 hours. And then on Saturdays, I definitely write all day. And usually on Sundays too, if I'm, really trying to make progress on a particular project. So, and we talked about feedback. There has to be room for feedback. So, when I'm doing a shorter story or the beginning of a book, I'm in two different writing groups, and we share bits and pieces of what we're working on. And one thing I've discovered, and I'm trying to think of how this really happened, maybe it was also just from practice and practice working with groups, but eventually I found that I really became to embrace feedback. And I'll write something and I just can't wait to get some feedback so that then I can do more polishing. And I think it comes from wanting to make progress. So I want to finish a project and I know it's going to need feedback, and I know I need to think, what's pulling people out of the story, what's working, what's not working. So that when I do so I really can't wait to get to the feedback stage so I can, it kind of speeds up your progress, right? You could just write in a bubble forever. And even if you polish, it's going to take you longer unless someone looks at it and goes, oh, well, that character didn't quite make sense to me, because would they really do that? I would think they were the kind of person that did that the way you set them up. And then be like, of course, now I see that. So it speeds up your polishing your progress when other people look at it and say, oh, I see this and I see that. And of course, a lot of things they see are good things. Oh, I really like the way that character is doing that, and I like the way these two characters do that. So then I can say, okay, that part's good. And when I get to a feedback session, I'm like, okay, just tell me the wrong stuff. I don't need the compliments. Just tell me what I need to do. And because I think when you want to finish something, especially a very long project, and novels are long, you want critical feedback to help you make progress. And eventually, from practicing that in writing groups, I really got to love feedback. And I know that's hard for a lot of people. Criticism is very hard, and it can still be hard. Even, even though I'm saying I embrace it, it can still be difficult sometimes. But it's so important that I think that even just trying to get yourself in that mindset of, yay, I can't wait for feedback is a really important mindset as part of the whole writing schedule and making progress on a project. Did that answer your question?
It did. Sorry, I should have mentioned this before we started recording. I have embraced the pause. So people go, "Oh no, dead air, dead air." No,
Yeah.
I'm synthesizing. I'm thinking about what you just
Yes.
said and sort of deep listening. Yeah. So I'm sitting here and I'm going, yes, absolutely, love, 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 feedback, love, love, love. I love the notion of sort of the different stages and being ready for feedback. What I tend to do is go, tell me what kind of feedback you want, because sometimes
Mm.
people are just only wanting supportive feedback. They just, that's all. I'm not ready to hear any critiques yet. Just tell me what you love about it or whatever. And I get to a point where I go, okay, tear it apart. I need to know everything that needs to be addressed. And I love that part too, because by that point, the story's solid enough that it's okay to have someone go, this made no sense. And this, and it's interesting because, and I do have a question here, I promise. So I'm helping my husband, who's going to have a show go up in July, right? Actually, right before your book release, which we're going to talk about in a little
Hmm.
bit, on the 17th and 18th of July, he's doing his God the One Man show here in New York City. And he asked me to help him do some rewrites. And I gave notes, and got to a point, and it's sort of a variety show, but it's God, the one man show, and it's God doing all the various things from the Old Testament. And it's very funny, and it incorporates juggling and all this other stuff. And there's one part of it that I went, you know, I don't think this fits with the rest of the show. And it's a huge chunk of the show. And he kind of had to think about it and go, oh, actually, it doesn't. It's more New Testament than Old Testament. Oh, okay. And then now he's going to probably use it as a sort of an encore if there's time and whatever.
Mm.
But the question I have for you is, have you ever gotten to that point where you're pretty much polishing and then realize, holy crap, this entire thing doesn't fit, or I'm missing an entire chapter or something that I need to go back and do? And if so, A, how does that feel for your creative process? And B, how do you fix it?
Yes, 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 yes. Definitely happens. Sometimes you write a piece and you're like, yeah, this holds together, and there's a little niggling in the back of your brain going, but does it? But you ignore that
Mm
voice.
hmm. Mm hmm.
And then someone else says, yeah, it's not really working. And you're like, oh, I kind of knew that, and I was hoping I was wrong. I think that you always have to trust your instincts about your writing,
Mm
and listen to the front, back, and sides of your brain, because it is going to tell you. Because for me, writing is fun anyway. And even if the story isn't working very well, I just keep going, because the characters are talking to me and I'm having fun. And, then when I read it after that, I'm like, yeah, the whole thing's just kind of silly and blah. Like, what, who cares? So how do you fix it? Well, feedback is a big part of that. Asking someone else, where did I go wrong here? Or what do you see that I'm not seeing? Or I am kind of seeing, but I'm lost.
mm.
And when I say feedback, I mean trusted feedback, right? One thing is important. I've been with my writing groups for a very long time. So something you said is very important. Something, you only want the encouraging stuff, especially when you're just getting started on a story. And we can say that to each other in our group. Hey, this is super rough, just getting started. Just, tell me what you think. And everybody kind of knows that means, help me keep going. And then there's the, hey, I'm at the end of polishing, what's not working here, what's boring, or what are you seeing? And the group has been together long enough that we trust each other. And even if the criticism can sound a little bit harsh, we trust each other that to know that we all have our, each other's best interest in mind. And certainly with in publishing, I'm working with the editor, and my editor is amazing, Sarah J. Henry, and she is very honest, which I love. And so I cannot get away with, sections or whole pieces of the story that don't really work or don't really make sense. So, I can, and I love to rewrite whatever she gives me suggestions. She says this part, that part, and I dive into it and I rewrite. Sometimes that's small and sometimes it's big. So when it's very big, the problems with the story, yeah, that can be daunting. And I think that again, I just, it's a job, it's working, it's fun work, and I love it, but it's still work. So you have to get down to work. And you say, okay, this whole big section isn't working. I put the pages aside and look at my structure. I look at my, I don't really call it an outline. I call it my action point list. That's just how I like to think of it. It's scene by scene by scene and story points one by one. And I look at my story points and I read them in a row as a list, as if that's the novel, right? Because to read your own novel takes 2 or 3 days. So every time you polish, it's 2 or 3 days. If you have to fix something, just to read the scenes, just to read the action point list helps you, it's kind of a short way of reading your whole novel. So I take very careful, minimal kind of notes on my story. I do that in advance. I write my action point list first, and then I write scene by scene. And when I don't do that, when I just try and kind of let the story go, that's when it does go off the rails, I have found. I really, have learned to work best with an action point list and really hone the story there and see what's working and not working in an action point list before I start writing the novel. So when I don't do that and then I go back to the action list, I'm like, yeah, why did I do it like that? It's not really working. So, I mean, the short answer is get down to work and, you know, rip it apart and start over sometimes. And it's part of the work. If you're lucky, you pay attention to your structure in advance and you have less of that tearing apart and starting over later. But every book is different.
And every writer is different. It's
Yes.
really, some people are plotters, some people are pantsers, and what fascinates me about me, I'll tell you that, I'll tell it that way, is that I start out being a plotter, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden, my characters have taken me, left turn at Albuquerque, and I'm going off somewhere else, and I'm almost
Yep.
playing catch up with what's happening, and I didn't realize some of the things that were going to happen. And I'm going to ask you this about the series that you have, because this is always fascinating to me. Do you ever have in in series work, because there's going to be a bunch of the Four Queens of Crime books, et cetera, and the other series is coming out soon. I don't even know how to ask it. Do you ever have, and if so, what do you do? Something that happens in book one, or something that you write in book one that you don't quite know why it's there, and then book two, or maybe even book three, gives you the resolution to that one little sentence that you put in, and all of a sudden you go in book two, oh, that's why that sentence was there.
Hmm.
Does that happen to you? And if
Yes.
so, how do you handle that?
I mean, I would say it a little bit differently. I think that, while I was writing the first Four Queens of Crime book, um, like you said, the characters come to life, right? And when I say I do my action point list, I don't stick to it 100% because the characters do come alive. And I think I'm kind of a plotter when it comes to the plot, but I'm a pantser within each scene.
Mm.
So I just kind of write, okay, this is the sequence of events. And this is approximately what's going to happen in each scene. But when I start writing that scene, things change. And that may mean that the plot changes or that action point list structure changes also. But I kind of need that first pass at the structure in order to become a pantser and write those scenes and have fun with it. But but the characters do come to life. So in the first book, or in any book, you make up all the characters, you kind of fit things together, and then as you start writing, the characters come to life and things happen, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. They want to do that, okay, and you go with it. And at the end of the book, I was, hoping to write a second book, and I feel like I forget who said this, but I fully believe in this. The end of every book is the beginning of a new story.
Sure.
So when I finished writing it, I didn't want it, of course, it's not like all those people die. The characters, some of them were real life people in my books. But they're also kind of real life to me. So when I finished writing the book, my imagination kept going with these characters.
Mm.
What are they doing next? What's going to happen with them next? And even the minor characters, right? So some of the little stories of the minor characters or the mid-level characters, their lives continue, and during, how do I say this? While I'm writing the book, their lives are real to me. So when I write them in a scene, even when that scene ends, their lives continue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when the book is over, there's all these, it's going to sound insane. There's all these little lives running around in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And, they just keep going whether I'm thinking about them or not. So then when I started the second book, some of the characters continued, and I do a lot of research for the historical novels. And the more research I do, the more those characters pop up and say, yeah, oh, this bomb was happening here. Yeah, I lived on that street and it happened to me. So like the research and the lives of the characters all kind of interconnect and sort of bloom with each other. And so some of those, kind of live stories that kept happening, I don't know if I could point to like a particular sentence that, I didn't know I was there. But then later in book 2 and book 3, there was bits and pieces that are continuations of the other books. And, I think I became cognizant of that at a certain point, and I wanted to leave certain things open so that that could happen. But I didn't know how many of these books I was going to write. So for me, it was just a way to sort of leave them living, to leave something sort of, they mentioned something that, is happening in their lives that we're not following because they're a minor character or even a major character, but later I could pick up on that. So I think it's a matter of allowing the characters to live and then later picking up on some aspects of their life that they hinted to that now I can continue.
And you do it really incredibly well. And so that brings me to actually what a wonderful segue you provided me. Thank you, Rosanne. Yeah, I've read the first book and I'm almost finished with Death at King's Cross. And here's the thing, and this is something you and I sort of talked about over coffee a couple of months ago, and that is you're writing real people. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and Ngaio Marsh. They were real people. They were real writers. They were living at the time you set them in this book. And this is obviously a fictional murder investigation set during sort of the London Blitz, right around the London Blitz. And so how did you research and honor the real people, the real voices? And that's another thing that I remember saying to you, that each scene that is focused on, let's say, Marjorie or focused on Agatha is written in the style of Agatha, or in the style, like you can almost hear Agatha Christie in her scene. You can imagine you're reading an Agatha Christie novel, even though it's obviously all your work. But how did you do that? And how did you take their voices and their documented lives and spin them into this very creative, entirely fictional situation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And it's very gratifying to hear that because it's a lot of freaking work. That's the short answer. It's a lot of work. So I, first of all, read all of their novels, all of their, if they had an autobiography, read their autobiography, read all of the biographies written about them, and any articles I could find, interviews. There was only a couple of kind of filmed interviews for Agatha Christie, and none for Marjorie Allingham or Niall Marsh, a little bit for Dorothy Sayers. So a ton of research, which but I loved because I loved learning about them and building their lives into my head so that I could write for them. And let me also mention, which you know, that Lillian Wiles, the detective chief inspector, who's really the main character of the books, she's a real person too. She was the first detective chief inspector at the CID in Scotland Yard, the first woman to have that position, and she was real live in the 30s, working at Scotland Yard. And that's one thing that really made me want to write the book, the first book, when I found her. And she actually also wrote a memoir, which is fascinating, about her time in Scotland Yard. So I read all these things, I took a lot of notes, and I had all these, I watched a ton of World War II documentaries, and really made myself as much of an expert as I could on those times, but all in service of the characters, like you said. So, what was Agatha Christie doing for the first book in the summer of 1938? What was she doing in the spring of 1941? And I'm kind of a maybe insane stickler of detail, but in my mind, I wanted to make these books accurate enough so that they actually could have happened. So it does sound insane. So the first book, I picked the summer of 1938 because all four authors could have been there. And, for those listeners who have not read the book, it takes place on a weekend at a manor house. All four writers come together to host a fundraiser for the Women's Voluntary Service, which was, to prepare for World War II that was imminent. And I thought to myself, this is something they would do. They would, they all did war service. They would want to help raise money for the Women's Voluntary Service, which was a very important, sort of homeland support during the war. And I thought, and I read all their stuff, and I was like, okay, I can't find any evidence of where they were on this particular week in time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they all came together and did this thing, and my book kind of lives in the gap of actual history. And same thing for Death at King's Cross. Is during the Blitz. It's 1941. I looked up what they were doing. Agatha Christie was volunteering at the dispensary and hospital. Niall Marsh was driving an ambulance back and forth to a hospital in Christchurch, New Zealand, where she lived. Dorothy was putting plays together for the BBC, and Marjorie Allingham was out in the country, and she wrote a beautiful memoir of her time during the war, where she helped a lot of the young people were sent from the city into the country to live with strangers just to keep them safe and out of the bombing. And she was involved in that. So I just took all these little details that I knew about their real lives, and I built in the gaps of where, I think if you're as crazy as I am and you actually try to fact check everything I wrote, you will say, yeah, that could have happened. There's no conflict in time or activity that would have stopped, my story that I invented from taking place. So short answer, a heck of a lot of work and research, but in such a fun, for me, so fun, because it helped me find my story, helped me craft the story, and taught me so much about that time in the world. And one thing we haven't mentioned, that all my books, even though they are historical mystery novels, it's very important to me that they have a parallel to our current time. So the first book is, during the rise of fascism and the concern about the war and how people are affected by that, how they react to that, that I think, or I tried to make it very relevant to what's happening today. And same thing with the second book. It does take place during the war, but it has a lot to do with, what shall I say, the way people are treated and the way people fight for each other and take responsibility for what's going on in the world. And that's what I'm trying to do for the third book too, as I'm writing that. So while the reason I love writing historical novels is because it's something we could read and dive into the history, but say, hey, this is so relevant to today, and it's important to remember what happened back then to help us live our lives today. So that's why, research for me is so important, is to be able to do that, balance fact and fiction and past and present.
I keep wanting to say mic drop. It's really, seriously, because, for example, in my first urban fantasy book, I set it in New York City, and I talk about a lot of locations, for example, and a lot of events that take place. And what I didn't know up until a few fans wrote and told me, people were coming to New York to find some of the places I wrote about, and some were miffed that some of these places were fictional. Some were real, but some were fictional. And they're like,
Right.
wait a minute, why doesn't this building actually house this really amazing ice cream store? And it's wonderful. It was gratifying and lovely. And also I was like, okay, from now on, I'm going to have to start putting in a list of what's fictional and what's not at the back of the book. But World War II, obviously, very real. All of the death and destruction, very real. And yet, like, to me, one of the most compelling elements of Death at King's Cross is that they're trying to solve this murder while London is also trying to survive this war, while England is trying to survive this war. And I guess the question is, how does writing a mystery inside an already really chaotic, dangerous historical landscape like 1941 in London change the way you build tension? And what does that wartime backdrop sort of allow you to explore emotionally that a peacetime sitting might not be able to do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think the wartime setting actually just raises the stakes and gives you extra built-in tension because of what's going on. And also, Death at King's Cross is a little bit it's murder mystery, but also spy thriller. So MI5 is involved, and the crime is blended and connected to the war and what has to happen in a war, trying not to really give anything away. So creating the tension, knowing that there's always danger. And it's funny because the characters kind of talk about this, because everyone kind of gets used to the bombing. And this is something I read, people became, and they kind of call it resiliency, because every night there was bombing, but during the day people went around their life went on with their lives. They went to work, they met family, they went out to lunch, and they kind of got used to the situation, especially since the war went on for so long. But the tension of of course, finding the killer and understanding that it was a bigger story than just one murder. It had to do with sort of the safety of the nation, let's say, because it's war and spies and intelligence. That actually was more fun and more for me, more fun to build it during that time, because the tension, there's already so many other kinds of tension going on. So in the first book, which is a manor house mystery, which is a little more, I don't know, sort of proper English, right? You're in a manor house, there's a murder, and you're all, it's a locked room mystery, and you're all everyone has to be someone who was in the house at the time, so it's sort of contained. The second book, Death at King's Cross, is wide open. There's no containing it. It's the whole city, it's the whole country, it might be the whole world. So it's a bigger, in a lot of ways, it's a bigger story emotionally and structurally, which in a way could be harder, because how far do you go, right? How much ground do you cover, physical ground? And I kind of go around the world with this book, which was fun, but it was bigger balls to juggle. So it was a lot more work to mold it and keep it together and make it make sense. But the fact that it was during the war, it did have built-in tension. And the third book that I'm writing now has a different kind of tension. So it's, every, like you said, every book is a little bit different. Every experience is different. I do want to say one other thing, going back to your previous question about, the voices of the characters, because one thing I did process wise, and I said, a good book takes 100 drafts. So as I'm doing every draft, I think, okay, this draft is for smell. This draft is for tension. This draft is for visualizations. This draft is for Agatha Christie. And I would sort of reread part of her memoir, reread one or two books that were, close to that time of when she wrote. And then I would do a polish of the draft, just her scenes, so that she was really in my head and really speaking in my head, because I just read her books and I just read her memoir. And I did the same with all of them. So, okay, now this next draft is Dorothy's draft. Reread her last book she wrote just before this happened in time in my story. Reread, articles and interviews with her, because there was no autobiography. And then do her draft, really being in her voice. So it's kind of like getting in the mood. Like when I'm writing the main story, I'm in the mood of the type of book, so the first book being a Manor House Mystery. I rewatched Gosford Park. I
Mm.
reread every, kind of Body in the Library kind of book, and all of their books that were, similar mood and similar, specific genre specific to that idea, to give me more ideas for the story and to get me in the mood of writing that story. So for me, mood is really important, and I think that I, I'm at a point where I could jump into a mood really quickly. So if I'm like on the subway for 20 minutes and I want to do a little bit of writing, I'm like, okay, get in the visual mood. Look at stuff and, what were they looking at? What were they smelling? What were they thinking about in that scene? So I guess, that's one of my techniques, is figuring out the right mood I have to be in to work on that particular bit. And that really helps me. It's like a cheat, it's kind of like a cheat code. It kind of speeds up your craft and technique. It's fun.
Okay. So here's the thing, though. It's
Okay.
not. No, 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 no. This is something that I'm like, okay. Part of this for me is, as I'm listening to you, I'm kind of going, okay, yes, there is this mood, but also there's an accessibility to what you're writing that I think is really lovely. And here's what I mean by that. I'm a ginormous spy thriller, Robert Ludlum, John le Carre, Graham
Mm,
Greene, Anthony Burgess's Human Factor is one of my favorite books of all time, et cetera, et cetera. I love the genre. But every time you read a Ludlum or a Le Carre, it's almost like you're watching it as opposed to being in it.
mm,
And there's always a little tiny bit of distance. Like you read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or you read Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and it's always, even though I love his writing, don't get me wrong, but I'm always a little removed, or maybe the story is a little removed from me, just a hair. What's interesting about both of the Four Queens of Crime and Death of King's Cross is that I feel like I'm right there with them. So there's a moment, and I'm not spoiling anything, but there's a moment when Lillian, she's working in her office, and she knows that in a few minutes she's going to have to pull the shades down, for example, because the bombs are about to start, and you have to have everything dark or you're a target. And I remember that from when I was a kid and we were living in Israel. The air raid sirens would go off, and we'd have to get downstairs into the bomb shelters, and you had to paint your headlights blue or black of your car, because if you didn't,
wow.
you were obviously a target, because they would drop the bomb on the car if they saw that there were lights. So it was very personal to me individually, but also the way you're writing this, it's very accessible in the best way. So I wanted to sort of
Mm.
say that part of it is that it's not, there's a mood, absolutely, but the mood is part and parcel of being able to be in the story and experience the mood instead of just read the mood, if that makes sense what I'm saying. So that's my long-winded way of paying you a huge compliment.
Thank you so much. That's probably the best compliment anyone has ever given me, and I'm a little bit verklempt for a moment. But I want to answer it because, I think that, you know, when I teach, I tell my students that the reader is a participant in the story, that the story can't be so perfect in every detail that it locks the reader out, that there has to be room for the reader to participate in the story. And I honestly, I don't think I do it consciously, not what you're like, especially the examples you give. I think I just try and make it real enough so that people feel like they're there,
Mm-hmm.
but also, and I think this is, you know, this is part of the genius of Agatha Christie. And some people use it as a criticism against her. And they say she's very minimal in her descriptions and whatever. But I think, I don't know if she did it on purpose, but I think that works because, again, if you describe everything too perfectly, then the reader's imagination has no place to
Mm-hmm.
participate in the story. If you, like, you know, if you had to picture Lillian's office, I didn't describe it perfectly, but I did say, you know, she had to pull the window shade down to leave her light on to keep working because of the bombs. So your brain is filling in what a Scotland Yard office might look like and putting you there, and maybe it's doing it, you know, it's subconscious, but your brain is drawing that picture,
Sure.
and maybe that's what helps you feel like you're there more, using just a few details to make people feel like they're there, but not giving so much description that it doesn't, they don't really connect to it. Because I think if you describe too much and it's not a place someone has been necessarily, maybe they can't relate to it because it's too new. I don't know. This is a good question because I never really thought about how I do it.
Yeah.
I just know how I teach it,
Yeah, but
and I
you
try and do it.
and you do it. And you know what, the my I'm not going to say criticism because that's not really the word, but my response to perfectly described settings is, but wait a minute, my imagination could easily create this world. So give me the touchstones and I will develop it from there. Like I will
Right.
populate the world with the things and the vistas and everything else. And I don't know if everybody does or everybody can. And I know there are some people in the world who do not have visual imagination. Their brains don't work that way. And so that probably makes it a little bit harder for them to get into a story where the
Hmm.
description is a little bit less present, I would say. And yet, to me, to a reader like me, who, and I want to say this, I was not a reader until I was in sixth grade when I had an amazing English teacher who helped me discover reading because I hated to read. I loathed reading
Hmm.
because I had to teach myself how to read because there was no ENL or ESL program. But once I
Right.
discovered reading and I discovered worlds were possible that were not the world I was sort of stuck in, that was revolutionary in my life. And that's one of the things that I'm I love as a reader and I love as a writer is to see when someone gives me a world that my imagination can make possible. And I think you do that incredibly well. Having said all of that, I want to ask you, and I know we're now at more than an hour because I can keep you here for the next 6 hours, and I won't, I promise. But I want to ask you, when you're looking at your creative process across writing, across filmmaking, and teaching at Tisch, what helps you enter that state of flow that will allow you to create all of that? And how do you help your students who are not there, who are, I'm not going to say blocked, but who are having trouble getting into their creative flow that will allow them to really become storytellers? Because a lot of people who listen to the show are writers, and a lot of them are writers who don't know how to do it, don't know where to go next, don't know how to
Mhm.
start. So I'd love your
Um,
thoughts on how to do that.
Sure. It's a great question because I talk about this a lot in teaching, and you know, you always have to go back to the beginnings yourself. Anytime you start something new or start something different, I think that mainly I start with character, right? So I build the characters, and you could start with one. And I'm a really big proponent for free writing, where you just, you know, set a clock or not, but just say, I'm going to write for 3 minutes without stopping, without thinking, just let it flow, and, you know, not censor and not even look at what I'm writing. I don't care about punctuation or spelling or cats meowing. I just keep writing until the clock says 10 minutes, and then I see what I have. So I do that a lot with my students, and usually after 10 minutes, I stop them and I say, okay, how long do you think that was? Because I don't tell them we're going to write for 10 minutes. And they say 2, 3 minutes. I was like, that was 10 minutes. You just got into
Hmm.
it because you weren't thinking about anything else. And for me, it's easiest to start with characters. So I might say, okay, here's a character, they're in a particular place. What happens? And for me, usually doing it from the character's point of view is best. Sometimes I think of it as like a journal entry or a letter to a friend, and I just write. And I can keep notebooks full of this character talking to me, and they begin to form and they begin to come alive. And if then I think, okay, well, what other characters are in this story? And I do the same for all of them. So I kind of write a little bit of a life story, or maybe I say, what was this character doing in the summer of between 6th and 7th grade, or on their first vacation, or what were the dreams they were having in high school? And I just pick some odd prompt for the character just to give myself something to go on. But basically, it's kind of like writing these little life stories of my characters, life stories that happen before my story begins, right? So if I say the story is World War II, 1941, in the middle of the Blitz, what was everything that happened to that character before? One of my favorite characters that came to me in my books is another female police called Mei Lee, and she's her family came from China when before she was born, and she grew up in London, and she's very East Side, and she became a cop when all her cousins are like working in the garment industry, and she's very different for her family, and her story just kind of came to me from these kinds of journal entries for her. She appeared in the first book as sort of this side tiny assistant character to the detective chief inspectors, and she insisted on being alive and being in the second book. And I just kept writing little autobiographies about her, and she came to life. And once they come to life, they want to participate in the main story of the novel, whatever it is I'm writing, because I know them, because they're real to me, because I've written their life story. And when I say their life story, I'm not writing 1,000 pages. Sometimes it's a few pages, or 10 or 20. Sometimes it's a bunch of little notes. Oh, May would do this. Oh, May would do that. And I keep all these little notes in my notebook, my note app on my phone, so that I can access them later. But yeah, I would say, to get started on a story, pick a character, and maybe it's based on you, maybe it's somebody you see when you're sitting in a cafe, but try and write a little life story of that character. Make it up. Use some research. Put them in a place and time, and read a book about that place and time, and think, well, what was my character doing when the first Pride Parade happened in New York? And it'll come to you. I think it that's what our imagination does. It brings things to life from the back end there, that we don't know where that comes from, but it brings people to life, and then we can make stories about them.
And that is so cool. And Mei Lee is one of my favorite characters in Death at King's Cross. I have to say, I enjoy her very much. And what's interesting about what you said is, I love the notion of, once you know something about the character, you know how they would respond in whatever situation you end up putting them in, because you know something about who they have been before. And obviously, it's stuff you've made up about who they have been before, but you know that someone who's got a fear of spiders would react a specific way if they ran
Right.
across a spider. It's a silly example, but it also allows for a certain amount of consistency, I think, in the writing, because you know who they are and how they would be, how they would react and respond, because you have that knowledge already written down. I use an app to do it, not a notes app, but an app that I have character sheets, but it's the same kind of thing. If I know someone is vegan, they're not going to be eating a cheese pizza unless it's vegan cheese pizza, right? That's a
Right.
silly example, but it is the example that works for me, because my protagonist is vegan. But this is one of those things where there is, over time, you can still go back, and it helps build the characters for, I'm assuming Maylee is going to be in book 3 and maybe even further than that if you do more. And that will give you a rich life for her. And that also enriches my experience as a reader. And I just wanted to say that when I can tell that something is consistent over time in a series, especially, that's really good for me because then I know the writer has been paying attention. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's
Doing the
sort of
work.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah, and
that,
it's true. And like what you said about like character sheets, I'm glad you brought that up. Like there's a million places online where you could have character sheets. I want to say like that great book Wired for Story, has a lot of great sort of detail advice. You could take who is it this I think is Ray Bradbury maybe said, what is your character afraid of? What do they hate? What do they love? What are they afraid of? There's all these little lists that you can fill in that help you get started on that. And then, sort of writing from their point of view helps you, helps them be in your head when you're writing about them. So yeah, there's just like but it's about spending the time, right? It's about having the time to do that and spending the time doing that. And I think, sure, one of the problems today is, people on their phones and social media takes up time. And, hey, listen, I wish I could go to a Broadway show every night, but, I'm busy writing. So it's you have to say, okay, I'm going to put the 1,000 hours into this that it takes to make it work, but it's worth it. And that's what you have to do to be a writer, to make a character real, is put all those hours in. It's like, what do they say? It takes how many times to make a friend? Like how many takes like 10 hangouts with a friend to really be friends? It's true with your characters. You have to spend a certain amount of time with your character to make them real in your mind so that you can write them.
I love that. Yeah, I'm gonna hang out with my characters, and that is, they feel very real to me. And it's interesting because I've set, for example, I go even past that in my murder mysteries that take place in D.C., the Terror Reader mysteries. The house she lives in is a house I lived in. And it's a great
Hmm.
house right near DuPont Circle. And I love that house. And I keep a picture. When I'm writing the house, I keep a picture of the house on like above my computer so that I can remember. And I also do this thing where when I have characters and I know what they looked like in my head, I will find an actor or celebrity or whatever who looks like that person and I will keep them. So I always know what that my protagonist looks like. Mila Kunis. I always know that. There's no there's no
Right, it
getting away
keeps
from
them
that.
real for you.
Yeah.
It's a great thing, and I'll tell you, that's what's sort of harder about historical mysteries is all that research and but definitely basing things on stuff is such a great portal into your stories. My other series that takes place in 1979 that comes out in October. The name of the book is The Spiral. That is based on my life in 1979. Like I was there in Greenwich Village in 1979, and 70% of that book is almost autobiography
Mm-hmm.
of what I was doing and what it was like then and the people I met. So there's a different, like you already put that work in by living it,
Right.
so the hours are there, but it's a different kind of research, right? It's like going back into your own memories and looking some things up to check yourself. But it's a different, and technically that is still a historical novel because it took place in 1979, I am told. But certainly because I wasn't alive in the 40s, it was a lot more research and work to make that real. But yeah, putting picking actors that might play the role or pictures of the places and using real places and using real people that you knew or just people that you met is all part of it. And that's sort of the fun of it too, putting them all together like a big puzzle, finding all those little pieces and putting them together so that they make one big picture.
And it is fun, and that's a lot of it for me. Is it's, yes, you have to have a certain amount of craft and a certain amount of confidence, and you have to have stories, you have to have imagination. But it's, if it's not fun, we don't do it. We our attention spans are
Right.
short enough nowadays that if it's not fun, eventually we'll stop. So, and I appreciate those words that you just said a lot because it's so true. So, Rosanne, as I mentioned, I could keep you here forever and ever. Amen. But I know that you have a day to get back to. You're spending the day writing, which I think is cool. Having said that,
Yes.
I know, hang on one second. I know that you have a book release very soon. And I was wondering if
Yes.
you would be willing to give some details on that so that listeners who are in New York City or around New York City might be able to come and help you celebrate the release of Death at King's Cross.
Sure, that's amazing. Yes, Death at King's Cross comes out. It launches July 21st. So please, it's pre-order everywhere. Please go to bookshop.org or wherever you like to buy books to pre-order if you like. Or um, all the local bookstores will have it starting July 21st, which is a Tuesday. The fun book launch, which is Thursday the 23rd, will be at Mysterious Bookstore in Tribeca. Mysterious Bookstore, if you haven't been there, it is the most awesome bookstore. It's all mysteries and thrillers and spy stuff, and the people there are great and always help you find something interesting to read if you don't know what to read. And my book launch is going to be there at 6 o'clock. Thursday, the 23rd. And we're just going to have a little celebration. I'll say a few things about the book, talk about the book a little bit, do some signing. And it's just going to be an hour and just for fun. So if you're in New York City on July 23rd, please come down to the Mysterious Bookstore. Go online to check them, and I'll give you my website and my socials too. But you can order it in advance from the Mysterious Bookstore, so they have a book for you there, so that I could sign it for you. Um, I think last year when I did the first book, they ran out because not enough people said they were coming, like registered to come. They just showed up, so we ran out of books. So if you're going to, please register and order a book in advance. For them and for you. And so you can find that on their website or on mine, rosannelimoncelli.com.org.net.
All right, cool. And so I'm going to put the link, I'm going to ask you for the link to order the book from the Mysterious Bookshop and also your links and all of that. And you just said, Rose, I love that you have .com, .org, and .net all. That's very smart. So yeah, I'm definitely going to put those on. But if somebody wants to find you, on socials. We mentioned socials a little while ago. Where is the best place to find and follow Rosanne Limoncelli?
Yes. Well, first of all, I know my name is hard to spell. So when I say just Google Rosanne Limoncelli, sometimes that's not the best way. But on Instagram, I'm RCL Brooklyn. Or, of course, if you typed in my name, it would come up. And I'm mainly on Instagram. I'm still on Facebook. I'm on Substack. And LinkedIn, honestly, I do a lot on LinkedIn because professionally for teaching and filmmaking, I have a lot of contacts on LinkedIn. So if you go to my website, and you could look up my name by Googling the Four Queens of Crime or my name, and if you get to my website, it'll tell you, all of those things, give you all of those links. But if you go to Instagram and do RCL Brooklyn, you'll find me that way.
Awesome. And that brings me to the very last couple of questions. But before I get to them, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to it. I'm verklempt. I'm kerfuffled right now because this is so. First of all, I love the way you write, and second of all, I love that I can consider you my friend. I think we've hung out at least 10 times now, so
At least.
and I know that you are also the incoming vice president of the New York Tri-State Sisters in Crime chapter. So that's going to be another sort of way to find out about Rosanne. If you are in New York Tri-State Sisters in Crime and you listen to the show, you'll be able to reach out to Rosanne as the vice president of
Yes.
the chapter. So that's really cool. And I just have a couple more questions for you. And they're silly questions, but I find that they yield some profound answers. First of all, what is it that wakes you up in the morning? And I don't mean your alarm.
Hmm. Um, Well, I think that I have to say story. I hope that doesn't sound corny, but when I wake up and, you know, when I wake up and I think I'm too tired to wake up, if I think of what story I'm writing, that really gets me going. So, I always have whatever story I'm working on just at the tip of my tongue, ready to go. And when I wake up, I'm like, okay, what's next? And that makes me want to get up and get some breakfast and get to work.
Wow. That's really cool. You know, what's interesting is that I never end a scene or a chapter when I'm writing without writing the first sentence of the next scene or chapter. I never, because I don't want to come to an end point and then start again. I want to have already started. So it's really interesting that you said that. And then I have the last question that I want to ask you, and that is, if you had an airplane, environmentally friendly, of course, that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
It would say joy.
Mm.
I think we don't spend enough time enjoying our lives. And I tell my students who say they don't have enough time to write, I'm like, you know what? Maybe that's okay. Maybe you're enjoying your life. Enjoy your life and you'll write later. Because what's more important if we're not enjoying our lives? What's the point?
Yeah, I think that that's a lovely way of looking at it. And it's, if you're not enjoying it, it means you're looking to the future, to something that hasn't happened yet. It might never happen, and you're already worried about it. So I feel like, yeah,
Enjoy
being
the day.
exactly, enjoy the day. Yeah, I've just read this wonderful book called Flow, and it's all about that notion of being right where you are when you're there. And it's revolutionized my life, actually, because I normally have a lot of anxiety, and I've talked about this on the show, so I'm not telling tales out of school, but this has really helped me sort of work out of that and kind of keep going back to flow. And I feel like when you're talking about joy, that's really what I'm taking away from it, is that staying in that moment and sipping from the joy glass, I guess. And that sounds silly, but there it is. Rosanne, once again,
That's fantastic.
thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Isolde. This was so fun. I love talking about this stuff, and I really appreciate talking about it with you because I think we really go back and forth just right. It was just really fun.
Oh,
Thank you so
yay.
much.
And hopefully you'll come back. I have some authors who come back. Every time they release a new book, they come back. So maybe you'll be back in the autumn and talk about The Spiral when it comes out.
That'll be great. So fun.
Awesome. This is Isolde Trachtenberg for the Your Creative Mind podcast. Super grateful to Rosanne Limoncelli for being here, and also reminding you, as always, to be curious, be creative, and most of all, be kind. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2025. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope.